from Humboldt State University, where she teaches in the critical race, gender, and sexuality studies department. Her research focuses on identity politics, resistance movements, and genocide studies. She created a very popular course at Humboldt entitled Narrating Genocide, and currently is developing a course focused on the experiences of female resistors during genocide and mass atrocities. As the granddaughter of an Armenian genocide survivor, Maral's research focuses on this genocide, with an emphasis on resistance and combating genocide denial. Maral has been awarded fellowships from a number of prominent institutions, perhaps most notably the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. She speaks to us today and asks the question, confronting genocide is denial enough? Maral, Attallah.
Thank you so much. I just want to thank the Center for the Study of Holocaust and Genocide Studies, y'all here at Sonoma State. Thank you so much. Diane, thank you for inviting me again. This is a wonderful opportunity. There's a lot of feedback. Can we turn it down just a little bit? Your parking situation is like a nightmare. It makes me feel like I'm at home at Humboldt State, just driving around looking for parking. Except you have amazing weather right now. I'm pretty sure it's like 40 degrees in Humboldt. So thanks for bringing this weather. Last time I was here, I think it's just a thing with the time change. I didn't recognize that y'all didn't fix your clock. And so I just kept talking, and then all of a sudden it was like, you have 5 minutes. And I was like, what is happening? So we will not do that today. I hope to leave about 30 minutes for Q&A for y'all, and we'll just kind of go from there. As Diane mentioned, I teach at Humboldt State University. I teach in the Critical Race, Gender, and Sexuality Studies department, mainly in the ethnic studies and women's studies pathways. There's some variations from the talk that I gave a few years ago. Obviously, there's some new denial that's taking place. I mean, it's pretty basic, right? Confronting Armenian genocide denial is acknowledgement enough. Hopefully, you know I'm going to say no, right? And then I'll kind of explain why. So let's get moving and grooving. I got a new clicker again. Every year I come to talk to you guys. Well, the second year, I get a new clicker, so we're going to hope it works. It works well. So some of the points that I'll be bringing up, is anyone in here familiar with Beverly Tatum? Beverly Tatum, she's a social psychologist. She does work, it's loud. Can you turn it down a little bit? Is that, oh, that is good? Oh, okay, that's good for you, then it's good for me. Who am I to say no? So Beverly Tatum does work looking at specifically racism, white supremacy, and I thought that her terms around racism using David Wellman's model of racism, racism is a system of advantage based on race. She came up with these terms, active racism, passive racism, and actively anti-racist behavior, to discuss kind of the nuances of racism. And as I was reading it, because this is the work that I do, I saw some parallels with my own work talking about genocide and genocide denial. And so I'm going to weave her terms into my discussion of denial, kind of overlapping with Deborah Lipstadt's softcore and hardcore denial. And Deborah Lipstadt uses these terms specifically in reference to anti-Semitism and the Holocaust. And she is a seminal scholar in her own right. I am not trying to co-opt her terms. It's also really important to note that with the Holocaust, it was a particular event, and so when she's using these terminology, I think that it is important to honor the fact that she's using it specifically for the Holocaust. So I know that for some of you, you might know about the Armenian genocide. I want to show you an 80-second trailer to a film that came out some years ago, just to get y'all maybe a little bit up to speed on what the Armenian genocide was about, and then we'll move forward into the talk. So can I just play it from this computer? Does that work? I don't know who I'm supposed to be talking to, but tech people? Okay, let's do it. 1915 to 1923, and you'll notice that that extends past World War I, and you might be wondering why. And the reason for that is that the killings continued after World War I. This is really important, because if this was just about expulsion of a people, then we wouldn't see the continuation of moving people out and then also the massacres that were taking place. So Armenians had fled the Ottoman Empire into Western regions, right? They ended up in what is present-day Armenia, present-day Azerbaijan, and so it's important to note that there were continuous attacks on the Armenian population. Remember, the goal here was extermination of the population in whole. Right, that was the goal, because when we think about the genocide, it's really important to note that, number one, Armenians were the first racial ethnic group to identify Christianity as their official religion in 301 AD. So you have a Christian population residing in the Ottoman Empire, and it's predominantly Muslim, predominantly followers of Islam. And so this goal of creating kind of a pan-Turkic, pan-Islamic region, Ottoman Armenians didn't fit into that. They didn't even fit into this idea of what it meant to be Ottoman because they were Christian. So when we talk about the genocide, the Armenian genocide in particular, we talk about 1.5 million Armenians losing their life, right? Their lives were taken from them. It's also really important to note that Armenians were not the only religious minority that was being persecuted during this time period. You have the Greeks, the Assyrians, the Chaldeans, and if you add those populations into what we call the Armenian genocide, you have estimated around 3 million people killed during this time period. So there's a few key dates to make note of, okay? 1894 to 1896, known as the Hamidian massacres. And so here during the Ottoman Empire, you had the Sultan Abdul Hamid. At this point in time, Armenians, like other Christians, you had a millet system. You had Armenians being considered what we would call second-class citizens. They couldn't testify in court, right? They had extra taxes levied on them. And Armenians were really upset about this because Armenians saw themselves as Ottoman. They weren't Turkish, but they were Ottoman, right? And so during this time period, it's estimated that 100,000 to 300,000 Armenians were killed throughout the Ottoman Empire under the orders of Sultan Abdul Hamid, because Armenians were rising up and they were resisting and they were saying, we're not going to be treated this way any longer. And so this is really the first time on the world stage that folks knew what was happening to the Armenians, this Christian population. And when I say the world stage, right, you know, when we think about genocide today, we oftentimes think about the Holocaust, right? And we use the Holocaust kind of as a litmus test. And I said this before, the Holocaust really was a significant and special event to pay attention to. It's not that we can't do comparative genocide studies, but it's also really important to note that the term hadn't even been coined yet. So using terms like crimes against humanity, right, this is what you see during this time period of the great atrocities that were taking place. This was the litmus test. What was taking place against specifically the Armenian population on the world stage, folks saw this and they thought, how could you know, a ruler or people do this to their own people? The problem is outside perspective looking in, they thought that Armenians were seen as Ottomans. They just didn't get it. So this sets the stage for kind of understanding a little bit more about what would take place. In 1908, you had the coup d'etat. This was the Young Turks under the Committee of the Union in progress. This is really significant, especially because you're now hearing for the first time the term Young Turks. Young Turks has been used more recently to reference, you know, young folks who are resisting oppression and fighting for their rights and whatnot. There's even a newscast. The leader, right, the guy who kind of created this, he's a known Armenian genocide denier. And in recent years, he's stated, oh, well, let's leave it up to the historians to decide. That is 100% passive denial, right? When you're moving from active denial to, let's just leave it up to the historians to decide. We are 100 years plus past this point in time. The historians have already decided this was genocide. There's no need to continue talking about it. We now need to move towards reparations. And so here you have a really popular, I think he ran for Congress and he lost in California. But you have this popular news site that a lot of young folks listen to and they think that it's very progressive. They've even made note, and mind you, this is strategic, that the co-host of the Young Turks news is Armenian herself. She's an Armenian descendant. And so folks will say, well, the co-host is Armenian. He can't be an Armenian genocide denier. And I always go like, have you never heard of internalized oppression? Have you never heard about people voting against their own interests? Like, how is this just the end result answer to you? She's Armenian, therefore it should be okay. So just maybe keep that in mind the next time you use the Young Turks as a reference point. So 1908, you had these folks who were like, we want a better constitutional system. We don't agree with the Sultan. We want equality. So they were pushing what we would maybe today think of as like a democratic system, right, with a new constitution and whatnot. They even said to the Armenians and the other Christian populations, hey, if you all, back us, you'll have equal access to equal resources. Armenians, backing them, thinking that this was going to be a really big thing for them. And then what you end up happening moves into 1909 and the Adana massacres. And this is really significant point because what ended up happening is the supporters of the Sultan were really upset about the coup d'etat, and they didn't go after the leaders. They went after the Christian Armenian population. This was a huge hit for the Assyrians. It's estimated that 30,000 folks were killed. The perpetrators were not held accountable by the CUP because at this point in time they were promoting pan-Turkism and kind of this pan-Turkic nation. They used the term that you'll hear, or the statement that you'll hear, a Turkey for the Turks. A Turkey for the Turks. Armenians were never thought of in this ideology of what it meant to be the new Ottoman Empire. In 1913, you have a nationalist faction of the Committee of Union and Progress, and this is where they start the next move. We know these folks as the orchestrators of the Armenian genocide. There were three folks in particular. They're called the three Pashas. There was Talat Pasha, Enver Pasha, and Jamal Pasha. These three Pashas controlled the Ottoman Empire. It's really significant to note when we talk about the Holocaust, everyone knows who Hitler is. When you talk about the Armenian genocide, everyone knows who Talat Pasha is. In fact, oftentimes there's memes where they'll put their imagery side by side and they'll say, if this didn't happen, in referencing Talat Pasha and the Armenian genocide, then this wouldn't happen, referencing Adolf Hitler and the Holocaust. I think that's a really simplistic correlation to make, but I think that it's significant. We know that in 1939, prior to Hitler invading Poland, which is really what sparked what we know of as the Holocaust, or the genocide specifically targeting Jews, we know that Adolf Hitler, he gives a speech to try to rile up his generals and soldiers and followers, and I'm going to paraphrase it here, he says, I want you to kill without pity and mercy all men, women, and children of Polish descent. After all, who today remembers the annihilation of the Armenians? He's talking about World War I. He's saying, yeah, this mass atrocity was committed and their leaders were never held accountable, right? Implying what? If we go through with this, you don't have to worry. No one's going to remember that. No one's going to remember this. No one's going to care. Essentially. It's also really significant to note that after Talat Pasha was assassinated, he had fled after the war, he was charged in absentia, but he had fled to Germany, he had lived in Germany, and there was a young Armenian, Soghomon Tehlirian, who saw him in a park, went up to him, and essentially said, "This is for my family," and shot him in the back of the head. Soghomon Tehlirian has a trial that makes international news. Soghomon Tehlirian is essentially proved innocent in what we would know of now as temporary insanity. Why? Because everyone knew what had happened to the Armenians and that these leaders were not held accountable. In fact, they had fled the country. They had fled the empire. I bring this up in relation to Hitler because you should note that Adolf Hitler signed orders to make sure that Talat Pasha's body would be moved back to Turkey. And he gave him full military honors on a train with the, the Nazi swastika flags on the train. And he was greeted as this, amazing hero. Talat Pasha is buried in Istanbul at the Monument of Liberty Memorial Cemetery. He's honored today. There are streets named after Talat Pasha, and that's really significant to note, because if I walk down a street in Berlin and I see a street named Hitler, you better bet that's not going to happen, right? And so it's really significant to think about the relationship between, say, how Germany has dealt with their crimes in the past and how the present-day Republic of Turkey is not dealing with their crimes of the past. And then, I'm not even going to give you necessarily anything underneath. I just want to ask you, what's the significance here of April 24th, 1915? Anyone? What's the significance? Because I know there's classes here, so yeah.
The leaders were arrested.
What leaders? Which leaders? Exactly. So if y'all didn't hear that, your colleague says, this is where the intellectuals, the political leaders were rounded up. We say Istanbul, but it used to be Constantinople, right? So they were rounded up in Constantinople. They were taken away. They were tortured. Most of them were executed. Some were able to escape. So this is pretty significant point. This is kind of the equivalent to, if you understand Kristallnacht for the Holocaust, that night, right, the night of broken glass, where specifically Jews were targeted. This is that point. This is that correlation to understand the Armenian genocide. So I don't know if you ever heard that song, Istanbul was Constantinople. Now it's Istanbul, not Constantinople. Nobody knows but the Turks. Okay, I'll let you sit with that one for a second. So the map that I have behind me here is pretty significant. This was from the Armenian National Committee of America. They put this out. And what you'll notice is you're going to see these red dots. The larger the dot, the larger the massacre site. This is present-day Armenia here. This is Nagorno-Karabakh, also known as Artsakh, right? And these are present-day Armenia borders, right, with majority Armenian population. So you have Armenia and Nagorno-Karabakh. I also want to bring your attention, because I'm going to tell you a story about my grandfather. I want to bring your attention to these clusters right here. So the black dots that you see are concentration camps. And that might be interesting for you, because you might think concentration camps, and again, think of the Holocaust. This is decades before what we would know of as the Holocaust. So these two clusters right here, this first one right there, that's Homs, Syria. That's where my father was born. That's where my grandfather ended up. My grandfather was one of the Armenians that was forced on the infamous death marches out of the Ottoman Empire into northern Syria, into the deserts of northern Syria here. When we think about April 24th, 1915, it is a really important commemoration for folks of Armenian descent in particular. And I'm going to have a task for you, should you choose to accept it, because we're coming up to the next April 24th. And although the United States Congress has acknowledged the Armenian genocide, finally, we'll talk about this, right? We don't need to pat him on the back too long. The President of the United States has stated that he doesn't believe that there was a genocide that took place. And so you get to take the opportunity to call the President of the United States, write the President of the United States, and say, I think you actually need to acknowledge the Armenian genocide. If you want, no pressure. Don't worry, I make enough phone calls probably for the entire room. So if you look at this map here, it's really significant because you're seeing the points where mass murder was taking place. And when we think about the Armenian genocide, you have to understand, you know, when the Ottoman Empire enters World War I, 1914, one of the first things that they do is they make sure to disarm any Armenian in the military. They also disarm the Armenian civilian population. And because of what was taking place in World War I, and oftentimes genocide takes place under the cover of war, right, to justify these mass atrocities, what was happening was the leaders in the Ottoman Empire said, hey, you know what, we think that our Christians, specifically the Christian Armenians, are going to side with the Orthodox Christians in Russia. Therefore, we're doing this for their own safety. And they started deportation because they didn't want anyone to side with Russia. They started deportations here. Something significant to know as well is Armenians were the only populations that were moved. The Kurds weren't moved, Turks weren't moved. They said specifically Armenians are the ones that we fear are going to side with these Christians to the east. And so they use this as justification for the deportation, or what we would know of as the death marches. And in fact, it wasn't about moving people, because if you just move people, you'd move them to the interior. What was happening is you were moving people actually out of the Ottoman Empire and then into the Syrian desert. And in some instances, you wouldn't even move them out of that region. They marched Armenians in circles until they died. They also had special units that went out on horseback to target Armenian populations. There's narratives that say that the Euphrates River ran red with blood because of the murders that were taking place. And so I'm not here to debate whether or not the Armenian genocide took place. It is a historical fact. And so we're going to talk about the denial of it. And if you want to learn more about this, there's some really amazing work that's being done. And you had a wonderful lecture even just last week. So let's go ahead. Oh, you know, one more thing that I wanted to say that's significant. Like, if you just think about like the psychology of the perpetrator, is really significant. When you think about the Holocaust, oftentimes there's the images of individuals being loaded on train cars, right? Cattle cars, train cars. During the Armenian genocide, you also had officials telling Armenians, purchase your train tickets. In fact, purchase a round-trip train ticket, because we're just sending you for now. You can come back, you're going to come back. It's for your own safety. And so you have Armenians who literally purchased a round-trip ticket to their death. The government, knowing that they weren't going to come back. And this is really significant, because if folks don't come back, what happens to their property? And I don't just mean if the parents don't come back. I mean an entire family doesn't come back. What happens to that property? That property then belongs to the state. So the government, knowing the whole while that Armenians weren't going to come back, this was incredibly significant. And it was really important to also get, right, to make sure that there was also compliance by another targeted group, the Kurds. And in present day, if you understand the relationship between Kurdish populations in Turkey and even outside of Turkey, you understand that in the Ottoman Empire, just as Armenians were minorities, Kurds were minorities, but Armenians were Christian. They were never seen as Ottoman. And so you have the Kurds being used as the middlemen to do the dirty work of the government officials, the Turkish government officials. This is plausible deniability, right? Because then the government can say, well, it wasn't us, right? It was, especially in the eastern part here, it wasn't us. All of this that was taking place, if there was anyone that was murdered or killed, it was the Kurds. The Kurds wanted those homes, they wanted that property. In fact, the government had told the Kurds, if you get rid of the Armenians, the area will be yours, the homes will be yours. And so this is really significant too, especially if you think about, there was a saying that Armenians had said to the Kurds. They said, the Turks will have us for breakfast, they're going to have you for lunch. Right? Like you're a pawn in this game. And I hope you understand that even in eastern Turkey today, the Kurdish population that's living there, living under oppression, right? Living under oppression on Armenian homeland. So significant, why? Because it was only until just recently that the Kurdish population was allowed to speak their native language. Because in Turkey, they weren't allowed to speak their native language. So again, right, it's that cycle of oppression. So keep the visual here of, like I said, Homs, Syria. And we don't know where my grandfather came from. So it could really be anywhere. It was just in 2015 I went to visit in Yerevan. I went to go visit the memorial, and there's a museum. And I had saw another map that actually showed that boats were used too, that people crossed in water. And that was really significant for me because I had always just thought it must have been a land movement. So it's not to say that it wasn't land movement. We know that there was a desert aspect to it, but it very easily could have been moving by boat and then walking through the desert and then coming and ending up in Homs. So let me share a little bit about my grandfather. So the world knows, just so you know, between 1915 to 1923, over 200 articles were published in the New York Times. In 1950 alone, it saw 140 New York Times articles on the mass murder of the Armenians. Remember, the term genocide hadn't been coined yet. Raphael Lemkin coins the term in 44. It becomes part of the convention in 48. He actually conceptualized this term a lot earlier with his 1933 Madrid proposal. And if any of you are interested, there's an excellent movie that I show my students on the first day of class. It kind of weeds people out, right? Like, can you handle it? It's called Watchers of the Sky. Watchers of the Sky. And it is incredibly powerful. And so it brings up Raphael Lemkin, his journey, contemporary genocides, the Armenian genocide, Ben Ferenc, who is 100 years old now, amazing. He was the youngest prosecutor at Nuremberg. He prosecuted the Einsatzgruppen. He was like 27 years old at the time, an American GI who did this work. And just recently, he's 100 now, but just recently he was kind of one of the main movers and shakers to get the crime of aggression now become one of the international laws that you can prosecute folks under. So the crime of making war, essentially. So look up Ben Ferenc, he's amazing too. In 1918, Theodore Roosevelt calls the Armenian massacres the greatest crime of the war. And he was president prior, 1901 to 1909. Okay, so this amazing, good-looking family, right? This is my father's family. This was taken in Homs, Syria in the late 1950s. This is the only photo we have of my grandparents. And so this handsome gentleman right here, look at him, so stoic. This is my dad. This is my father. My father was born in 1935. His name is Antun Attallah. These are all his siblings, and then sitting front and center, my grandmother Miriam, she was of Assyrian and Armenian descent, and then my grandfather here, Attallah. And you know, something significant, my grandfather, kind of like Cher or Madonna, he only, you know, was known as like the one name right there, Attallah. Attallah means gift from God in Arabic, and you'll understand how ironic this was because the family that raised him never treated him like he was a gift from God. So the story of my grandfather goes like this. He was estimated to be about 3 or 4 years of age. So you've seen him. Let me go back to the map so you can kind of visualize it. 3 or 4 years of age with his sister, his older sister, maybe just a few years older than her, maybe 7 or him, 7 or 8. They were the only 2 of their family to survive the infamous death marches into the Syrian desert. We don't know what happened to his parents. We don't know even if he had siblings other than his sister. We don't even know her name. We just know that somehow they made it to Homs. And there were, obviously you can see the dots are concentration camps, right? So there are these like enclaves that were set up. The story goes is that when they finally made it to this destination, his sister bartered him for a loaf of bread so that she could have something to eat and that hopefully he would have a better life. That's where her story ends. We don't know what happened to her after this point. We know that a family by the name of Khalil ended up adopting my grandfather, and they took him in to raise him, hopefully his family, and it didn't quite work out that way. And so what ended up happening is that after a few days, they didn't want him anymore. They said, this kid he's sickly, he's upset, he's not talking, we just don't want him anymore. And so what did they do? They literally locked him out of the house. And this was a Christian family that had taken him in, the Khalils. And so he's literally discarded on the side of the road there with the trash. A cousin or a family member had come by. They saw him outside and he's crying. And so they bring him into the home and they essentially shame their family. And they say, what are you doing to this young boy? Mind you, my grandfather was always referred to as the Armenian or the Armenian orphan or the orphan. And they said to the family, are you not a God-fearing people? Do you not remember what happened to him, to the Armenians, to the Christians? He's Christian. Like, what kind of Christian family are you? So they shamed the family enough that they decided that my grandfather could live with them. But they never gave him the family name. They never gave him the last name Khalil. Instead, they gave him one name, Attallah, again, which means gift from God. So my grandfather has this one name. What you should also know is after the war, there were groups of people, organizations that had gone around looking for the Armenian orphans. In fact, at one point they had heard about this Armenian orphan that was taken in by the Khalil family. And so they asked the Khalil family, where's the Armenian orphan? They had hid him from these groups. So they didn't want to raise him up. They didn't want to treat him as family, right? But they also didn't want to give him up. And so they hid him in like a silo. And so there were several attempts to kind of find him. There was a woman early on who had said at one point, I know him, I know that boy. And I know his family. And this is really the only reference point that we have, is that she said he's a Schillingerian. This was just one woman's word. She didn't want to take him in. This is after the war. Everyone's struggling. But she at least gave, this name. And this name has proven so significant for me. Do you remember how I said I went to, in 2015, I had gone to go talk in Armenia. This was the 100-year marking of the Armenian Genocide. And I had gone as part of the International Association of Genocide Scholars, and I had gone to this museum, and I'm walking around this museum, and I see this picture of one of the intellectuals who was rounded up on April 24th, 1915, and he's Dr. Schillingerian. And Dr. Schillingerian sharing this name, again, in Armenia, the Schillingerian could be the equivalent of like Johnson, right? I mean, it's a significant name, but to me, it was the first time I had ever seen it and seen a picture. And I stared at that picture for so long, because for me, I thought, could this have been like my great-grandfather? Could he have been a great uncle? Could he somehow be related? And in this weird moment, even just a few weeks ago, I was deleting emails, and there was an email from a colleague about, you should look at this journal. And they had sent it to me like years ago. And so I'm cleaning through, and I just went and I saw the index. And it was almost like an aha moment, like the sun's shining in my office. It was like, it gleamed right on this title. And it was an article that was written by Tanner Acham. Tanner Acham was the second gentleman scholar who you heard speak. He has the bushy little mustache in the film that I showed you. And Tanner Acham had actually found out so much about Dr. Schillingerian. I was late for class that day because I just sat there like reading this article, learning everything I can. So most likely, I'm not related to Dr. Schillingerian. But we never know. And like that is, I say it in jest, but that's also the tragedy of the Armenian Genocide. We may never know. We don't know who we're actually related to. And this is why William Saroyan's quote, when he talks about the Armenians, and he says, you can send them into the desert, you can burn their churches, right? You can take away their music, you can do all of these things to Armenians, but ask me when two Armenians meet anywhere in the world if they do not create a new Armenia. And that's one of the most beautiful sentiments I've ever heard, because it rings true, because I meet an Armenian and even the coronavirus can't stop me from hugging you, right? Because I'm like, you're my family, we're connected somehow. And so saying all of this to you and just being here, being able to share my grandfather's story, having this be recorded is so incredibly significant. I don't know if y'all have even any idea of what this means, especially for my family. Because my grandfather, although he survived the genocide, it haunted him for the rest of his life. In fact, when my father was a young man, he recalls taking my grandfather to a doctor, and what we would now know of as post-traumatic stress disorder. This doctor said, your grandfather's suffering trauma from the massacre. And my grandfather was a sweet, kind man. He never raised his hand to anyone. He was very quiet. In Homs, he was a weaver. My grandmother was also a weaver. And my grandfather was a really hard worker, and he would make these cloaks where, you know, another weaver, they might make one in a week, and my grandfather would make 2.5, and he would constantly have to be that much better. And so folks in the town, they knew of him as, again, still the Armenian or the Armenian orphan, but then as he was an adult, he became the good Armenian. Oh, he's the good Armenian. In fact, my father, when he was a young boy, he lost his hearing, and there was a doctor. He was actually for glasses, for eyes, but he was the only doctor. And my grandfather took my dad to go see this doctor, and rather than the doctor turn him away and say, well, I only treat eyes, I can't help him, he took it upon himself to get medication for my dad. My family didn't have a lot of money. But he took it upon himself to really care for my dad, and he helped him a great deal. And they came to find later that he was also Armenian. And when he found out that who my grandfather was, he made it his mission to make sure that he would take care of my dad. This is William Saroyan's quote in action, right? And so with my grandfather, if we go back to the picture, this is really the only picture that we have. These are all of my father's siblings. And at this point, my father, he's 85 years strong. He retired from teaching 2 years ago. What? And not because, you know, we live in the United States and, like, unfortunately, we don't get to retire, right? He loved teaching. And so he retired 2 years ago, and it was very, very sad for him. This is his only sister that is still alive. The rest of his family is gone. Okay, so when we talk about denial, right? This goes back to my point about Deborah Lipstadt. First of all, it's really important to know that there's processes to genocide, right? So there's, you know, the dehumanization aspect of it, authorization, routinization. I'm sure you all know, like, there's processes to it. When we talk about a genocide, it doesn't have anything to do with numbers. Sometimes people get confused and they use the Holocaust as a litmus test, and they say, well, like, you know, for the example of the Armenians, they'll say, well, there was a population of 2 million, 1.5 million were killed. Yeah, that makes sense. It definitely was a genocide. You can't do that, right? There's process and there's intent. And as flawed as the convention is, and just so you know that when we talk about the Genocide Convention, although it was a gathering of people in, like, international law, like legal terminology, it literally just means a treaty. So it's the treaty, right, for the crime and the punishment and prevention of genocide. And so with that said, there's processes that take place. Oftentimes people will say that denial is the last stage of genocide. I used to think that, and then I talked with some folks and kind of realized, well, denial is taking place all the time. Right? You remember the plausible deniability that the Turks put forth to say, well, it was really the Kurds that were doing this, not us. Denial is constantly taking place on the part of the perpetrator group. Why? Because they want to continue the job of exterminating a population or removing a population. So I'm going to talk a little bit about denial here. But also it's important to note that there's, we categorize people. So we say, there's a victim group, there's a perpetrator group, there's bystanders, there's rescuers. I want us to focus on this idea of upstanders, right? So for the sake of kind of the timing in our talk, I want you to think about upstanders. And upstanders are the folks who call out the perpetrators. They call out the deniers. They're the folks who say, even though I might benefit from staying silent, I'm not going to. If this is not going to happen in my name, this is not going to happen on my watch. So the upstanders. And without recognition of fault, there can be no healing for genocide victims and their descendants, and without recognition, there can be no resolution. So if we don't address denial, then we actually can't move forward. So again, the point that I had said prior, right? And if you don't know who Deborah Lipstadt is, please look her up. She's phenomenal. I think right now every year the Holocaust Memorial Museum has a scholar come, kind of the in-house scholar, and this year I think she's at the museum. You can contact her, you can email her. She teaches at Emory University. She will write you back. She wrote a book. Her book that just came out, Anti-Semitism Here and Now, I think is just a foundational text to use. I went through it quick. And I think especially right now in the climate that we're living in, especially in the United States, it is incredibly important, and globally, right, to understand, when we talk about a resurgence of racism or a resurgence of anti-Semitism, I think we're really naive to say a resurgence because it implies that it went away. Right? And oftentimes for people who are not targeted, because you don't have to see what you don't have to see, you don't see it. And then folks who are targeted or marginalized, they're living it. And so I think that her book is really incredible. But she comes up with these terms, hardcore and softcore denial. Hardcore is the outright denial, right? It's saying it never happened. Softcore is saying, in relation to the Holocaust, maybe some folks died, definitely not those numbers. Maybe people were killed, but there were no gas chambers. So it's somewhat acknowledging that something happened, but any bit of kind of confusion that can be put forth or any question as to whether or not it occurred would be considered, softcore denial in terms of the Holocaust. So I use active denier, passive denier, and then taking it a step further, no disrespect at all to Dr. Lipstadt, but taking it a step further, this is one of the reasons why I wanted to use the Beverly Tatum terminology, because she also acknowledges in her terminology, again, like I said, passive racism, active racism, and then she talks about being actively anti-racist, right? So she's saying even if you're not actively racist, if you still benefit from a system of racism and you don't call it out, you're still racist. So for me, I was thinking, if we are not actively calling out denial, right, then we're still complicit in that denial. And so the goal here is to be an active anti-denier, to call out the passive deniers and call out the active deniers. And in relation to the Armenian genocide, the hardcore deniers are going to be Turkey and Azerbaijan, and the softcore deniers would be the United States, even though they did just recently, Congress recognized in this non-binding fashion resolution, right, the Armenian genocide, I still consider them to be softcore deniers, especially in the United States as a government, because the president's stance, and also just kind of the way that it came about. I don't think that our Congress folk in just a few weeks unanimously in the Senate were like, oh yeah, it is really important that we acknowledge the Armenian genocide for the sake of acknowledging the genocide. I think what was happening with our relations with Turkey, right, our NATO ally, this was kind of a shove to Turkey, because for generation after generation, there's been opportunities to acknowledge the Armenian genocide, and generation after generation, it has been stopped. And as recent as just a few weeks even prior to the unanimous Senate vote, there were senators who would stand up and say, I don't think it's the right time. We don't really know the accuracy. And again, the famous, let's leave it up to the historians to decide. So upstanders, I mentioned Raphael Lemkin, folks who are calling out genocide, addressing genocide in general, and the Armenian genocide in particular, the International Association of Genocide Scholars, for which I'm part of. 32 countries have recognized the Armenian genocide, European Parliament, Council of Europe, and then US Congress, right, the House of Representatives. And there was a huge rebuke after the House of Representatives voted, and then the US Senate. So just recently here. We also have 49 states. Oh, Mississippi, right? Good old Mississippi. Just waiting on them. I had a student who asked, they said, well, when Mississippi acknowledges it, not if, but they said when Mississippi acknowledges it, don't you think the president will be forced to acknowledge it? Because how can you not acknowledge it if the states say it, Congress says it? And I said, well, like, no. He's not forced to do anything. He's the president of the United States, he's his own person. It would be the right thing to do, and not just to appease people, because again, this is a historical fact, right? This is a historical fact. Turkish intellectuals that you should know about Taner Açam. Taner Açam is, Armenians love Taner Açam. Taner Açam is a genocide scholar. He was born in Turkey. He is a Turkish historian who teaches in the United States. He has gone toe-to-toe with the Turkish government, his own government, to call out their denial of the Armenian genocide. He has had his life threatened on numerous occasions. He has been arrested and charged. I'll talk about Article 301, right, denigrating Turkishness, simply for recognizing the Armenian genocide. And why do Armenians love him so much? Not only did he take the Turkish government to the, the European Court of Human Rights, and say that they were violating Article 10, basically freedom of expression, because he is an academic and he writes about this, and he won. Right, he won. They said, oh yeah, Article 301 under the Turkish Penal Code, yeah, y'all, no. And the Turkish government's like, well, okay, maybe we'll kind of like pull back a little bit on this. So he wins, but even more significant to this, in 2018 he came out with a book called Killing Orders, Talat Pasha's Telegrams and the Armenian Genocide. This was called The Smoking Gun. Why? Because Taner Açam, being able to go into the Turkish archives, was able to find these telegrams. Now, for today, right, the telegrams were so significant. If you think about the sophistication during the Armenian genocide, they were using the railway, right, but also telegrams to move information. And so the Turkish government thought that they had their coding down. They're like, no one is ever going to figure this stuff out. And he found on actual letterhead codes that he connected to other just kind of random statements that were being made and being put forth, and he was able to essentially overlap those codes and then decipher what were these killing orders. So when we say the smoking gun, you know, most perpetrators, they want to do away with any evidence, because even if genocide, the term wasn't coined then, you know that you can't just outright kill people. You can't just take their property. You can't just move them from one area to the next under the guise of it's for their own safety. We know that the Ottoman authorities didn't care about Armenians. One of the ambassadors to the Ottoman Empire at the time, Henry Morgenthau, had relayed conversations that he had with Talat. And in one conversation that Henry Morgenthau had with Talat, Talat says to him, you know, I wish you would just get your American insurance companies to just give us the names, right, of the beneficiaries of their clients, because, you know, they're not going to need it. Need what? Need insurance? Like, what do you mean, right? Essentially saying, like, it's going to all come to the government anyways. There's not going to be any descendants. There's not going to be anyone when these families are gone, right, to have the property and whatnot handed down. So the insurance benefits were going to go to the Turkish government. All right, what denial looks like. Now I know you can't read this, but I wanted to put it there to just show you how wild this is. On the right-hand side, this was what popped up on my computer screen in 2007. It's some rubbish. I'll read it to you. But you'll notice off to the left, I say official policy and then personal and individual, right? So what does denial look like? When we think about, denial, there's denial for perpetrators, there's denial for bystanders, both during genocide and after genocide. And there's reasons why both groups are going to deny during and why folks are going to deny after. But I think it's significant to think about official policy, right? So when we think about denial as official policy, following the physical destruction of the people and the foundations of their culture, memory is all that is left, and it is targeted as the last victim. Complete annihilation of people requires the banishment of recollection and the suffocation of remembrance. Deny, 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 and if you deny long enough, right, it will become truth. When denial becomes official policy, the false narrative becomes embedded within social, political, educational, and even legal institutions. Such extreme actions have no room for reconciliation between victim and perpetrator groups. When denial is institutionalized, once again the state opens the door to violence in the form of threats, vandalism, and even death to anyone who questions this official policy. So when I talk about official policy, you should note that in Turkey, in particular, but also in Azerbaijan, right, there's a complete denial that the Armenian genocide even took place. If, for example, in the education institution, young kids grow up learning that there was no genocide, that if anything, maybe some Armenians died, but this was part of war. If anything, it was the Armenians that were the perpetrators. They were trying to break up the Ottoman Empire, that they were committing treason, that the Armenians were the problem here. And so young children grow up in Turkey thinking Armenians were and are the problem. This is really significant, especially for minority Armenian populations still living in contemporary Turkey. So official policy also is pretty famous in relation to Article 301. So Article 301 in the Turkish Penal Code essentially says one cannot denigrate Turkishness. You can't talk smack on Turkey. And part of calling out the state for what you think is improper behavior or relations can get you charged under Article 301. And it is significant to note that really anyone who has spoken out against the Armenian genocide and that has had a significant voice in this matter has either been threatened with being charged under Article 301 or has been charged under Article 301. And this is punishment of years in prison for doing so. So folks, I'll let you Google it. You can look it up because we got to get through this. But it is important to know that there are some pretty famous folks that have been charged. And like I said, Taner Acem was one. Hrant Dink was another one. And Hrant Dink was assassinated in 2007. And he was assassinated shortly before I received my first round of threats for bringing attention to the Armenian genocide. And it was significant for me because of what had happened to him. So when we talk about official policy, it literally is leaving out this significant event in history, charging people under the law, and then just even through social relations. So I don't think that you can actually address official policy, or you can't address individual denial if you don't address official policy, right? I don't actually blame even students of my own, people that I've become friends with growing up who grew up in Turkey. I don't blame them at all for not knowing about the Armenian genocide. Their education system let them down. There's a reason why they don't know about the Armenian genocide. So the personal individual here, I'm going to give you a little short rundown. When I was doing my graduate work on the Armenian genocide and bringing attention to my grandfather's survival, I had contacted an educational website that had interviews of genocide survivors, Armenian genocide survivors. And I wanted to use this in my research, and as a good researcher, I said, can I have access to this, and how would I cite you? So I sent them this information. I said, my name is Maral Attallah, this is the work that I'm doing, this is what I believe, Turkey is wrong, blah, 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 blah. Here's my address, my phone number, all that stuff. Shortly after contacting them, their website was hacked, and I started receiving threats. This then moved into not just threats, but having to involve the FBI, and it got really crazy. And I was just a graduate student in a rural area, literally just trying to tell my grandfather's story. And I thought, oh man, this is too much for me. And so what the website, or this message that was put forth, right? What says your freedom and human rights ideas? Do not curse to our religion. Never make treachery to our country. Otherwise we will erase all of your sites from the internet. We hope that you meet with terrorists and that your police and soldiers are killed by terrorists. Then maybe you can understand us. After now, you have no chance to make a mistake about Turkey. If you make a mistake about Turkey, you will see our hard reaction. We will never stop for hacking your sites. We hate from anybody who curses our police, soldiers, prime ministers, and we will show our reaction as soon as to them, because we are in the service of the Turk nation. So this was cited directly from that website, and I started receiving messages, one in particular that I will always remember. Your name is Maral Nicole Attallah. You live at, they gave my address. Your phone number is, they gave my phone number, and they said all of your windows and doors are open. And I just thought, oh my gosh, what is happening? And I wanted to stop the work that I was doing, and towards the end of this talk, I'm going to mention an interaction that I had that really changed the course of my work, and that was an interaction that I had with, at that point in time, he was one of my thesis advisors, survivor of the Holocaust, Dr. Samuel P. Oliner. And so I'll talk about that talk, because that was very significant for me. Also, shout out, today's Sam's 90th birthday. So, happy birthday, Sam. He's not going to watch this. He's busy. He's retired. He's living his life. I'm going to make him watch it. It'll be his gift. P.S. I just want to say, I'm going to just like a side note here, because I'm looking at the time, and I got I'm going to give myself maybe another 30 minutes, and then we'll have our Q&A. But I do want to say how incredibly awesome it is to be here. Thank you all for coming. This is a great size crowd, because it's so nice out, but also the fact that you have the opportunity to come to talks like this, I am so jealous. If my institution had something going like this, I would be here every week. And so I just want you to kind of recognize the work of your professor, Dr. Parnas, and also just the center and your institution, because this is rare, y'all. This is not across university campuses where we have these talks. And I always kind of prepare myself when I have a talk like this for there to be some deniers, and maybe there's some of you out there, and we'll chat, we'll talk, it's good, no worries. But I do think it's really important that, you know, for the most part, y'all are coming, maybe it's for your class, but for the most part, you're coming because you wanna learn a little bit about what's taking place. So Article 301, I mentioned it to you. Again, I know that you can't read this, I just really wanted to put it up there for reference. You'll notice nothing really changed. So the Turkish government gets called out on Article 301. They want to enter the European Union. They're like, hey, y'all maybe need to address some things like Article 301. You can't silence people. You can't tell people that they can't talk smack on Turkey, right? So originally it said denigrating Turkishness, the Republic of Turkey, the institutions and organs of the state, and they said, okay, we'll make some changes. So they changed denigrating the Turkish nation rather than Turkishness. They're like, we're so vague with Turkishness, we'll just say the Turkish nation. We're so specific now. The state of the Turkish Republic, the institutions and organs of the state. One of the things that I want to note here is there's been it kind of died down after 2007 because of the murder of Hrant Dink, and then we saw an increased use of Article 301 in the previous years. And 2016, when you had folks were rising up in Turkey, really having nothing to do with the Armenian genocide. They were just saying, hey, guess what? Like, you are violating our freedom of speech or freedom of assembly, or we don't think that what's happening with our government is right. You have professors who were being targeted. Anyone that was speaking out against formerly Prime Minister Erdogan, now President Erdogan. In 2017, there were the referendums where Erdogan basically got rid of the prime minister position and ensured that the president position had all the power, and then ensured that he could be president for as long as he wanted to be president. Pay attention, right? Folks were speaking out. They said, you can't do this, this isn't right. And so folks who were speaking out were arrested and charged under Article 301 for denigrating the Turkish nation and the state of Turkey. In 2019, just recently in October, if you remember, the United States government pulls out of Syria, and I just want to say, because this is being recorded, that that was absolutely horrendous, and that the future generations will see just how horrendous that act was for the United States to leave our Kurdish allies like that, because it opened the door for the Turkish government to then go into Syria and engage in what many would say are human rights violations. And if you say that, guess what? You'll be charged under Article 301. In fact, just recently there were some members of a human rights organization who have been arrested because they did just that, specifically talking about Turkish incursion into Syria in October of 2019. So outcomes of genocide denial. On the left-hand side here, you're going to see there's a New York Times cover piece, A Century of Silence. I say impacts of social psychological well-being, and then that there's no deterrence to commit genocide or genocide denial. And you'll see that there's a picture here of Turkish President Erdogan, and then also Azerbaijani President Aliyev, and then the Hurriyet Daily News headline, Karabakh, right? Karabakh is Nagorno-Karabakh, also known as Artsakh. Armenians call it Artsakh. Karabakh is as much our issue as Azerbaijan's. The Turkish president says this. You should also note that Turkey and Azerbaijan, that they have stated that they are one nation in two states. So Turkey 100% supports anything that the Azerbaijani government does, including targeting Armenians in the Artsakh region in what is surrounded by Azerbaijan. So let me just talk to you a little bit about impacts of social psychological well-being. So there's a lot of work that's been done in the last few years looking at intergenerational trauma, looking at how descendants of trauma survivors actually, they can see like gene mutations, so that if you are a descendant of a Holocaust survivor, that you actually carry those experiences with you. It's really wild. Rachel Yehuda is doing really good work in that area right now. And I want to be really clear here that when I talk about genocide denial, I'm not ranking the effects versus, perpetrators and descendants of perpetrators versus victims and descendants of victims. I think that it's important for us to pay attention that, like, post-traumatic stress disorder doesn't just affect victims and or survivors, I should say, and their descendants, also perpetrators and their descendants, right? Because you have to live with, quote unquote, the sins of your father. And that's really significant. And if you think about present day Turkey, you have an entire republic that begins on the back of a genocide. All of a sudden, you can be prosperous. Why? Because there's an entire landmass that has been vacated. That's property that is now yours. You don't have to compete for resources. So if you think about acknowledging genocide, especially if we're just talking about the Armenian genocide, current folks in Turkey, current Turks are not guilty of that genocide, but they are responsible for addressing past harms because they have benefited from that genocide. Financially, educationally, they are the descendants benefiting. And so we'll talk a little bit about what might seem controversial. I don't know why it's so controversial when I talk about giving back the land, but I guess, it is. So social psychological well-being, you have to think about victims, you have to think about their descendants, and you have to think about perpetrators and what has and what is happening. If we think about trauma, Ada Ilarian had written a book, Consequences of Denial of the Armenian Genocide. She writes, in many cases where parents experience depression and mental illness as a result of their traumatic experiences, children could sense the sadness but had to make sense of what happened to their parents and grandparents in their imagination, rather than being able to speak about and come to terms with the reality within the family. And you see similar discussion points in relation to the concentration camps that the United States set up during World War II, specifically for folks of Japanese descent. That you have children and grandchildren who maybe take a college course and they realize like something had happened during World War II, but they don't really know what, and then maybe they look into it and they see that there were these camps that were set up, and that their grandparents actually lived in these camps, but their grandparents never talked to them about it. And so then they learn and they research about the reality of that situation, and it's really hard for them to have a conversation with their grandparents because their grandparents don't want to talk about what happened. Why? Because there's also that shame, right? And I think that that's really important to address as well. With descendants, because it's not a lived experience, like I don't have that lived experience, I can't call it collective memory. For my grandfather, with other survivors, they have the collective memory. What I have is collective remembering, or Armenians that are descendants of survivors, we have what is called collective remembering, because as a group, we're remembering the stories that have been told to us. And then also perpetrators. So I show you this picture here. This is a church in Diyarbakir. It says it fell into ruins after 1915. It's super important that that eastern region, Armenians call it Western Armenia or occupied Armenia, but that eastern region, there's a reason why it's heavily populated by a Kurdish population, right? The Turks will have us for breakfast, they'll have you for lunch, but this is where folks have grown up. And you have, a few years ago, you had an example in Diyarbakir where members of the Kurdish population, the mayor, they all were acknowledging the Armenian genocide. They actually were apologizing for it. Now, whether their apology was genuine or not, that's a whole other conversation for a whole other time, right? Because I would love it if an apology was genuine. I actually don't care. I care about the outcome. I think that if you can get people to make changes and then in time they change what they feel deep down in their heart, that's great. I think if we wait for people to change deep down in their heart, for there to be structural changes, we will be waiting a very, very long time. The fact that my father is 85 years of age, and I've done this work, this is like my life's work. I will do this probably forever. I don't see myself doing anything else other than telling my grandfather's story, and the fact that we live in a time where there are mass atrocities taking place even today, it is my duty to share that information with people. And it's not an easy task at all. But I think that it's important for us to recognize the role that we play in bringing attention to these atrocities. We have to be active anti-deniers. And so in this case of like an apology, is it real or not? You know, my dad's 85, and for me to be able to call him, to like walk out of class and call him and say, Baba, they did it. Congress did it. They acknowledged the genocide. You know, his response to me, this is wonderful. We will celebrate today, but we have more work to do tomorrow because we want the land. And this is so significant, right? Because for him, I never thought that he would see the day that Turkey would recognize it, and I started to think that he wouldn't see the day for his beloved, you know, new home, the United States. He's lived here. He's been a citizen for over 40 years. He worked for the U.S. government. He has benefited from education that was provided to him by the government. He has benefited from the relationships he has given back to this country. My dad is, when we talk about patriots, my dad is a patriot to this country. He loves this country because they gave him things that he never would have had access to in Syria. And it broke his heart every time April 24th would roll around and there wasn't a recognition. And so to be able to kind of share that with him is really significant. So if we think about, Diyarbakir, I think that that's an important point to note. Why? even if the apology isn't sincere, these are Kurds in contemporary Turkey calling out the Armenian genocide. We would be naive to think they are not risking their life in doing so. We'd also be naive to think that in doing so, they wouldn't garner support from Armenians in the diaspora that would maybe help them with their cause in present-day Turkey. But I think that there's a give and take there. Bringing your attention to Erdogan and Aliyev, Azerbaijan and Turkey, Erdogan said in just October of this year, in response to international pressure to account for the incursion into northern Syria and the reported human rights abuses, he stated, "Turkey has never committed any civil massacre in history." He also said, "We will do our best to ensure the territorial integrity of Azerbaijan," while referencing what he called Armenian, quote, occupation of Karabakh, Artsakh, and other, quote, supposed ancient lands of Azerbaijan. So he's essentially saying that where Azerbaijan is located, that those are the ancient lands of Azerbaijan. We have historical proof that these are the ancient lands of Armenians. And it doesn't necessarily mean that people can't coexist on land, but if you want to talk about who was there first, we could definitely get into a discussion about that. So moving towards recognition or reconciliation and resolution, you'll notice here that I put the R and the E. I think that it's important to note that oftentimes people want to use the term reconciliation. Reconciliation implies that there was a conciliatory relationship to begin with, and Armenians and Turks did not have a conciliatory relationship to begin with. So I think that it's better to think about it in terms of conciliation or resolution, right? A resolution to this issue. I can't do justice to this report in just kind of explaining some points from it, but if you want to learn more about reparations, I'm sure all the questions that you have and answers you have, if we can't answer it during the Q&A and whatnot, this is a really foundational, important report. You can get the PDF online. Resolution with Justice, Reparations for the Armenian Genocide, the report of the Armenian Genocide Reparations Study Group. This was chaired by Henry Theriault, who is also Armenian and a descendant of an Armenian genocide survivor. And so we're gonna get into some chats here, right? So no reconciliation, I'm just gonna use the term because people know what it means. There's no reconciliation or resolution without recognition and reparation. So you can't just acknowledge it. Acknowledging it is great, recognizing it is great, but there has to be something structural that comes out of it. Why? Because if it's just an apology, right, well, where's the meat or the tofu of it? Right? If it's just an apology, the next government can come in and say, yeah, no. If it's just a recognition or an apology, right, what does that do to repair harm from the past? And again, remember how I said, it doesn't even have to be genuine, right? So don't apologize if it's not genuine, or apologize and then make a genuine move forward. So no reconciliation without recognition and reparation. So here we go, y'all. Wilsonian boundaries, right? Wilsonian boundaries, land reparations. This is really important. Some argue that the Treaty of Sèvres was not superseded by Lausanne. Therefore, international law would say that Wilsonian boundaries are the proper boundaries of the Armenian state. And so after the war, right, there was supposed to be compensation for our Armenians that suffered. Everyone knew what happened. They're trying these perpetrators in absentia, right? Like everyone knew. They said everything's going to be fine, move forward. They basically placed the borders of Western Armenia into what is present-day Turkey, almost cutting it in half and saying this belongs to Armenia. You then have a movement into Soviet era. Soviet government makes decisions, starts signing some treaties. Armenians are not privy to those treaties, and all of a sudden, no one wants to hold what now becomes the new Republic of Turkey accountable for those crimes. In fact, you have Western powers trying to court Ataturk's new Turkey, right? Oh, they're using the Arabic alphabet. Oh, they're changing their style of dress, right? They want to be a democracy. So they're trying to court them because of the strategic location of Turkey, which really isn't far off from the main reason why most nations, in particular the United States, didn't recognize the Armenian genocide earlier because of the strategic location of contemporary Turkey and all of the wars that we have and are waging in the Middle East. Incirlik Air Force Base is important to note. And Turkey has said, if you acknowledge this, then you can't use our Air Force Base. It's kind of like, we're going to take our ball and go home. And the United States is like, no, don't, we want to play, right? Not recognizing that like we are huge financial supporters, military supporters. We contribute to the Turkish government in ways that are really significant. And so these are hollow claims. So Wilsonian boundaries, so land reparations, give us our land back. We want our land back. And the law, right, legal scholars have said this might actually hold fruit here because there was a binding agreement that was put forth in arbitration. So regardless of the treaty, right, that there was an agreement that had been put forth with the Treaty of Sèvres, but even just this, the part of the arbitration was that land, and so that should come no matter what. Monetary compensation, this is incredibly important, right? Like, if you don't want to give the land, then you should at least compensate. Germany has done it, other states have done it. To say like, oh, there's no money, we just don't have it, is absurd, especially when you're talking about oil-rich communities, and even communities. If you can buy every year new weapons for your military, then you can set aside some money, right, for reparations. Even better yet, don't even worry about addressing your military. How about the millions and millions of dollars you spend denying that the genocide took place through funding institutions with like historians, right? You lobby Congress. There's so much money, y'all, you wouldn't even believe. There's a really great movie called Architects of Denial that just came out. And one of the things that they do in that film is they go to Congress and they ask members of the caucus of U.S.-Turkish relations, do they think the Armenian genocide took place? And then they follow up. Are you being paid by a Turkish lobby at all? Did you get a free trip to Azerbaijan? And they're, these congressmen and women are just like walking to the elevators like, and in one point she's like, nice dress. She's like trying to talk to someone. It's like, they're literally asking you, do you believe atrocities are taking place? And you're complimenting someone on a dress. That tells me you're receiving major kickbacks. Restoration of Armenian place names. I went up to Canada a few years ago, British Columbia. It's not that they necessarily have to change the name, right? It's, hey, how about put up a sign in whatever indigenous language it is and say, and this is the historic land of. Give people the opportunity. We do it all the time, right? We have like street names and then up above it's like, and this is also the honorary name, right? So restoration of Armenian place names. At the very least, get rid of streets and schools named after Talat Pasha. That's the very least. Return and restore historic Armenian churches and actually let Armenians practice their faith in those churches. Don't just say, in good faith, we're going to restore this church, but you actually can't use it, even though it's been here for hundreds and hundreds of years. We'll let you use it on one day. Honest inclusion in Turkish and Azerbaijani textbooks about what happened during World War I and post-World War I, especially in regards to kind of more contemporary time. In Artsakh, in Baku, what happened to Armenian populations that had fled into these areas, and the continued war that's taking place. So if you think about with Azerbaijan, Azerbaijan is still continuing a military offensive against Artsakh and also the borders of Armenia. That's huge. Why? Because even just in the last few months, the United States has provided military aid in the millions to Azerbaijan because of our dispute, right, with Iran. Because of the regional location of the border of Azerbaijan and Iran, the United States government is like, we want you to have access to all of these military weapons should you have to use them. It's not telling them how to use them. Right? So if all of a sudden drones are being used and an air attack potentially could be used in Artsakh, or Armenia, it's important for the United States government. If you're going to give funding to one, give funding to another, because you're setting up bloodshed. Museums devoted to the genocide, really important, right? Because then you can't say it didn't happen. And then memorials and days of remembrance, right? The reason why these are really important, y'all, is because this allows for regular opportunities to confirm recognition and apology. So it's not just, we did it in 2015 and we're never going to do it again. Let's do it annually. Why? Because as years go on, new generations are born, and they need to learn about that past as well. And so I want to give you a local example on my end of this taking place. So I live in Humboldt County. Humboldt County is surrounded by maybe close to a dozen indigenous tribes. It's important. We're on Sonoma State, the band of the Pomo American Indians. So knowing where you live and knowing where indigenous people have historically lived and live today. These are not a people of the past. These are folks who live right now, and that's really important. So reclaiming Wiyot land, there's a stretch of island that's in the Humboldt Bay, and I'm just going to be real quick with it. In 1860, there was a massacre that took place on this island, and this was organized by locals, local white settlers who, for whatever, gave their reasons for it, but they did it specifically on the night that was part of the World Renewal Ceremony for the Wiyot people. And Tuluwat Island is, for the Wiyot people, it's known as the center of their universe. Every year they would spend a week, 10 days, where it was they were dancing and singing and commemorating to rebalance the world. And there were organized attacks that took place on Tuluwat, also known as Indian Island. We're trying to get people to stop calling it Indian Island. It's Tuluwat. Use the Wiyot name for it. And so there were organized attacks that also happened on the South Spit and the Eel River. Indigenous people were attacked. This was also the night that the settlers knew, because this was a yearly event that happened, that all the men, for the most part, had gone to get supplies. And so the only people that were on this island were women, children, and the elderly. And there were white settlers who had come by boat, didn't bring their firearms, but instead brought knives and hatchets, and they massacred this population. There were people that were able to swim off of the island, and unless you know the island and you know the surrounding area, you cannot imagine. This is in February, this is in winter, you are swimming in a bay, it is pitch black, and you have folks who had made it from that island 20 miles away on foot. They survived this. And the Wiyot people, that was the last day that they had celebrated the World Renewal Ceremony. But in recent years, in the last decades or so, they had started doing a vigil. And so folks would come in February on that night to give a vigil. And in 2000, in the year 2000, they were able to purchase 1.5 acres, and the picture that you see off to the right is the 1.5 acres they were able to purchase, and they built this little building here. The city of Eureka, in a really kind of unprecedented move in 2004, they contributed an additional 40 acres. Now, these are private lands. The white is the private land. So there's a former mayor, there's some people who own private land there. I know an individual who had owned property there who said that they would never, ever, ever sell their land. It's their land, they love it, that's that. I said, okay, that's wild, because a massacre took place there. You literally can only get there by boat as well. And I said, you do you, right? In 2019, so just in October, the Eureka government, and let me read this to you because the National Congress of American Indians calls this the United States' first known voluntary municipal land return achieved without sale, lawsuit, or trade. So long story short, the Eureka government decided, the city council decided they were going to give the deed back to the Wiyot people. There was a very wealthy businessman who I will name, Rob Arkley, who owns private property at first didn't disclose that he owned the property and offered to buy this land, this 202 acres for $500,000, well above the price that it was worth. They found out that it was him, and there's a reason why he would want to buy it for so much, because if he bought it for so much, then it would mean that that was what the land was worth, and if that was what the land was worth, guess what? His private property is also worth a lot as well. He also stated that it's ridiculous when they found out who he was. He stated, this is absolutely the equivalent of paying reparations, which is foolish. He said, just giving away this land is really irresponsible. What are they going to do with it? It actually doesn't matter, Mr. Arkley, because you are not Wiyot. So it doesn't matter what the Wiyot tribe does with it. You have no say in what they do with it. Just like I am not Canadian. What Canadians decide to do with British Columbia is not my business, because I'm not Canadian. So when we think about what had taken place, I think that it's really important to consider the fact that land can be given back. In fact, another significant point to note is that there are a few indigenous communities that receive honor taxes, and the Wiyot people are also a community that receives the honor tax. It's important to note the Wiyot people didn't set this up. It was local business folks and organizations who wanted to honor the sovereignty of the Wiyot people and respect the fact that we are residing on their land. Humboldt State resides on Wiyot land, and our local community college also resides on Wiyot land. And so just recently, this was actually just the other day, College of the Redwoods President Keith Flamer and Wiyot Tribal Chair Ted Hernandez commemorate a new partnership between the two entities by unveiling a new sign welcoming visitors to Wiyot land on March 4th. The community college sits on ancestral Wiyot land. Flamer told a few dozen people who had gathered in the college parking lot for the ceremony, so that the college will be paying the Wiyot tribe an honor tax for allowing it to sit on Wiyot land. In addition, to the signs and partnership will include the development of an interpretive trail and food forest that will be open to tribal members, students, and the community. It's about saying that we recognize that you are a people who still exist. You are sovereign. There is past harm that was done to you. We may not have done it, but we reap the benefits from what has been done, and we want to acknowledge that we want to live with you and do our best to live in harmony. This is not a kumbaya, let's hold hands. This is like real, this is happening, this is right now. And anyone can pay this honor tax. And you can pay whatever you can from it. My colleague, Dr. Kutcha Risling-Baldy, she is the chair of the Native American Studies Department, and she's really awesome. She has a blog called Sometimes Writer Kutcha Risling-Baldy. And she has done just great work acknowledging what is taking place and kind of calling out officials. And she gave a talk recently at San Diego State called Thanks for Coming, Now Give Back the Land, Decolonial Musings, Radical Imagination, and Yes, Your Mascot is Racist. And she gets a lot of mail from folks who are like, well, how's this gonna happen? Y'all, we pass down land all the time. And generally it's people who like don't own any land, like they don't even own a car, and they're like, we can't do this. It's like, well, you don't even own anything to give it up. Like, why are you so entitled to feel like it just can't be done? And the beautiful thing that's come out of a lot of her talks is there have been individuals who've said, hey, you know what? I own a house in Eureka. I don't have any kids. When I pass, I'm gonna give it to the Wiyot people. It's a house in a neighborhood. And there could be people who are like, well, what's gonna happen? The Wiyot people can decide what to do with it. I don't know, maybe sell it and then take that money and do whatever they want with it. So to say like it can't happen, it actually can happen, and it is happening. I want to show you this slide here. This is Dr. Samuel P. Oliner. I stole this slide from his picture. I cropped it from his Facebook. So I just want to put that out there. I think that it's important for us to be active anti-deniers. And when I was dealing with all the threats, I was 22 years old, and I had gone to Dr. Oliner and I said, Sam, I was crying in his office. I said, Sam, I don't know if I can do this. They're threatening me, and I just don't know, and I'm done. And he's like, are you finished? And he's like sipping tea, right? He's sipping tea. He says, are you finished? And I said, yes, yeah, yes, right? And he goes, he basically tells me to suck it up. And when a survivor of the Holocaust tells you to like get it together, you get it together. And he says to me, he says, that's what they want you to do. They want you to quit. you can't be silent. And he's like telling this to me, and I'm like, I had lost so much work. My computer was hacked. Y'all, it goes deep. And I said, I can't do this, I can't come back, I have deadlines. And he ended up helping me create what was really a significant part of my graduate work, my thesis in particular. And it really was sitting there and hearing him say, like, you can't let them win. That had such a profound impact on me. And this is right after Hrant Dink was assassinated. These people knew where I lived. You know, fast forward some time now, contemporary internet, you can Google me, and all of a sudden you know where my dad lives, you know where my sister lives, you know all sorts of things. And it is daunting to say the least, but we have to be active anti-deniers, because if we're not, then the denial wins. And it is never an easy thing. When President Obama was senator, he said that he would acknowledge the Armenian genocide, then he didn't. And I was like thinking 2015, he's doing all sorts of things that he says he's gonna do, because you know, he's on his way out, and we thought, oh, he's gonna acknowledge the Armenian genocide, and then CNN says, hey, no, he's not. And so then as I fast forward through, you know, he says this, I say this, right? My response, right? On April 21st, 2015, CNN runs a headline, Obama won't call it Armenian genocide on the 100th anniversary. On April 22nd, 2015, I wrote a letter to President Obama urging him to keep his promise to acknowledge the Armenian genocide. I vowed to contact the president once a week, reminding him of his promise and stating that I would not stop until either he used the term or he reached his term limit. Between April 21, 2015 and January 10th, 2017, I wrote, called, or emailed the White House 97 times. You don't have to clap for me, but just know I'm not allowed to go to the White House. So in 2015, I gave that conference in Armenia, and I made international news. Didn't bode well. In 2016, I was detained at the Abu Dhabi airport. Y'all, it was crazy town. I was like, is this really happening? In 2016, I had one of my fellowships with the Holocaust Memorial Museum. From 2015, like September 2015, I had asked to go to the White House, tour the White House. And like just before I was supposed to go, I get this email, White House tours. And then it's like, you're not supposed to reply. Request denied. And I was like, oh. And my friend, she said, you know what, homie? Don't worry. Tupac was denied too. And I thought, oh, dang. I'm going to leave you with this image here. I showed this the last time I was here. It was more recent then. Remember how I said you could Google me? You could Google me and find out my address and my phone and all that fun stuff. Long story short, my sister had gone to go test drive a car, a very fancy car. And she didn't like the salesman. He was a little too aggressive with her. And so he kept saying, well, give me your contact information. So she gave him some bogus information. I get a phone call or a text saying like, hey, Yaran, which is my sister's name, the email you gave me didn't work and your phone number doesn't work. Like this fool had searched deep into the web to find this phone number that was associated with me and potentially my sister. So I'm showing you just part of the texting. And I wrote her, I said, hey, what's going on? This guy's writing me. She's like, he's a creeper, he's a weirdo, don't reply. So I didn't reply. And I just said, oh, you know what? I think you have the wrong number. I don't know who you're talking about. So I pretended I didn't know. And then a few minutes went by and I get this picture. And that's the Turkish flag, right? And that's a Turkish soldier with their rifle. And then after a few minutes, I get the sorry, not meant for you. And I was livid. And I'm little, but I'm scrappy. And I was like, I know where this guy works. This is a threat. Oh no, buddy, it's on. You just lost your job. Like, it is on. And my sister, she pleaded with me. She said, don't do anything. Pretend you don't know. He knows where Dad lives. He knows where I live. And for my sister's sake, I wrote, please delete my number. I'm not sure who you are or why you're sending this to me. So I tell you this because I give lectures in my own class where I have students who will engage in softcore denial. I give talks where people will engage in softcore and hardcore denial, or passive and active denial. It's never easy to be an active anti-denier, but it doesn't mean that we can't be. And so I was nice and I left out the guy's last 4 digits of his phone number, but again, I'm little, but I'm scrappy, right? And so I'm just gonna leave it with some key points to remember. Acknowledgement and recognition is not enough. No reconciliation resolution without recognition and reparation. Indifference kills. Choose to be an active anti-denier. You can't just say, like, I'm not going to pick a side, because you're picking a side. Call the White House and demand that the president acknowledge the Armenian genocide. 1-202-456-1111. Call and write your congresspersons and demand that they support legislation that protects Armenia and Artsakh from Turkish and Azerbaijani aggression. Thank you all so much. Really appreciate it.